The first time my wife laughed at my car in front of strangers, I didn't say a word, because the most expensive thing in that parking lot wasn't the Mercedes she pointed at, or the Lexus her friends arrived in, or even the glass front dealership glowing behind her like a palace of chrome and pride. It was the silence I kept in my mouth. My name is Michael Anderson, 43 years old, born and raised outside Columbus, Ohio, and for most of my adult life, I believed a man's worth was measured by what he protected, not what he parked in the driveway. That belief sounded noble until the woman wearing my last name stood under the bright white lights of Sterling Coast Motors, lifted her champagne glass toward my old blue Ford Taurus, and said, "There he is, ladies and gentlemen, my husband, arriving in a museum exhibit." The laughter came fast, polished, expensive, the kind of laughter people use when they want cruelty to sound like a joke. I had just pulled into the dealership lot after working a 12-hour shift consulting for a logistics firm across town, my shirt wrinkled at the cuffs, my hands smelling faintly of coffee and printer toner, my old Taurus clicking softly as the engine cooled. It had 218,000 miles on it, a dent near the passenger door from a grocery cart storm, and a radio knob that fell off if you turned it too hard. It was not pretty. It was not impressive. But it was paid for, reliable, and it had carried me through hospital visits, winter storms, late-night airport pickups, and the kind of hard years people forget once the money starts coming in. Jessica knew that. She knew every mile on that car had a story attached to it. She also knew exactly where to cut. Her friends turned to look at me like I was part of the entertainment package, something included between the shrimp trays and the ribbon-cutting speeches. Jessica stood near the showroom entrance in a white blazer and heels sharp enough to make the pavement feel judged. Her blonde hair was pinned back perfectly, her smile bright enough to sell a lemon as luxury. Sterling Coast Motors was her kingdom, or at least she liked to call it that. Technically, she was the general manager, the face of the place, the woman in the commercials pointing at SUVs while telling families they deserved better. The owner, Frank Bellamy, was in his late 60s and spent most afternoons playing golf, leaving Jessica to run the floor, charm the clients, and remind everyone within earshot that she had built the dealership's reputation. That night was supposed to be a private celebration for a new luxury import line. I had not even wanted to go. Jessica had insisted, then spent the whole week reminding me not to embarrass her. Wear the Navy suit. Don't talk too much about work. Please, for once, don't drive that thing up front. I had smiled through it because marriage teaches a man to swallow small insults in the name of peace, but small insults are like rust. They spread quietly beneath the paint until one day the frame gives way. When I stepped out of the Taurus, Jessica's eyes flicked from my shoes to the car, and I saw the decision form before she spoke. She didn't have to do it. That is what stayed with me later. Nobody forced her. Nobody backed her into a corner. She chose the joke because the audience was there, because their approval mattered more than my dignity, because somewhere along the line I had become useful in private and embarrassing in public. "Michael, honey," she called, loud enough for the sales staff to hear. "Did the tow truck drop you off, or did that thing actually survive the trip?" A man near the entrance coughed into his drink to hide a laugh. A younger salesman named Tyler grinned like he had just been handed permission. One of Jessica's friends, a woman named Amanda who treated every conversation like a status competition, tilted her head and said, "I think my grandfather had one of those in high school." More laughter. Clean, sharp, practiced. I closed the car door carefully. I didn't slam it. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there with my keys in my palm, feeling the worn plastic edge press into my skin, and looked at my wife as if I were seeing her across a courtroom instead of a parking lot. The dealership windows reflected everything back at me. The old car, the bright showroom, the people smiling. Jessica glowing in the middle of it all like she had won something. Maybe she had. Maybe humiliating me was her way of proving she belonged with the polished people and the six-figure buyers and the men who leased new cars every 2 years just to avoid looking ordinary. I walked toward them slowly, each step steady, each breath measured. Inside my chest, something cold settled into place. Not rage. Rage is noisy. This was quieter than that. This was the moment a man stops defending an illusion. Jessica leaned in as I reached the group and brushed invisible lint from my sleeve, a gesture that looked affectionate from a distance but felt like correction up close. "You could have taken an Uber," she whispered through her smile. "Tonight matters." I looked past her into the showroom, at the polished floors, the hanging banners, the line of cars under soft lights, and for one strange second I noticed things I had ignored before. The nervous finance manager by the coffee bar, the stack of unpaid vendor envelopes tucked near the reception desk, Frank Bellamy standing in the corner with the tired eyes of a man pretending business was fine. The dealership looked rich, but so does a house right before foreclosure if the lawn is still mowed. I knew numbers. I knew debt. I knew the difference between shine and strength. Jessica squeezed my arm a little too hard, still smiling for everyone else, and said, "Try to enjoy yourself, okay? Just don't tell people you drove that here." That was the second laugh, softer than the first, but somehow worse. I nodded once. "Sure," I said. My voice was calm, even, almost warm. She turned away, satisfied, already forgetting the wound because she had not been the one cut. But I didn't forget. I stood beside the woman I had loved for 18 years, under lights bright enough to show every scratch in the paint of my old Ford, and listened as she told a circle of strangers that success was about image, that nobody respected weakness, that some people needed to upgrade before they got left behind. She thought she was talking about cars. She had no idea she was talking about herself. And while she laughed, while the glasses clinked, while the showroom doors slid open and closed behind us, I looked at the Sterling Coast Motors sign glowing above the lot and felt the first clean shape of a decision forming in my mind. I didn't know every step yet. I didn't know how soon Frank would call me desperate, or how quickly a business built on pride could start bleeding through its polished floors. But I knew one thing with a certainty that felt almost peaceful. My wife had mocked me for the last time in front of people who thought price tags were the same as value. The old Taurus ticked behind me in the cooling night air, faithful as ever, ugly as truth, and for the first time all evening, I almost smiled. That night should have ended with me driving home in silence, swallowing the taste of embarrassment until it turned into something easier to live with. For years, that had been my method. Absorb the comment. Smooth the room. Tell myself Jessica was stressed, ambitious, under pressure, not cruel. But when I walked through those showroom doors beside her, something in me had already stepped back from the marriage and started taking notes. The air inside Sterling Coast Motors smelled like leather, floor wax, and expensive coffee. Bright ceiling lights slid over polished hoods like liquid silver. Salesmen moved between guests with easy smiles and name tags pinned straight, laughing a little too loudly at jokes from people who wore watches worth more than my Ford. Jessica glided through the room as if every reflection belonged to her. She touched shoulders, kissed cheeks, shook hands, and became the version of herself I had once admired from across crowded rooms. Confident, magnetic, untouchable. I stood near a black SUV with a sticker price just under $80,000 and watched her tell a retired couple that luxury was not about transportation. It was about being seen correctly. That phrase stayed with me. Being seen correctly. I wondered when she had stopped seeing me at all. A server offered me a glass of sparkling water, and I took it just to give my hands something to do. Across the room, Tyler, the young salesman with the perfect haircut and the hungry grin, leaned close to Jessica and said something that made her laugh again. Not the public laugh this time. A warmer one. The kind she used to save for my bad jokes on Sunday mornings when we were still broke enough to count grocery coupons at the kitchen table. I felt no jealousy in that moment, only a tired kind of recognition. The marriage was not dying because of one joke in a parking lot. That joke was just the invoice finally arriving. I remembered our first apartment in Dayton, 650 square feet above a dry cleaner, where the heat clanked like an old train and Jessica taped magazine pictures of beach houses to the refrigerator. Back then, she loved my stubbornness. She said I made ordinary things feel safe. We ate boxed pasta, drove the same Taurus to job interviews, and celebrated when I landed my first serious position. She was selling used sedans then, wearing flats because heels hurt after 10 hours on the lot. I would bring her coffee during closing shifts and sit in the corner while she finished paperwork. She used to say, "One day, I am going to run a place like this." I believed her. More than that, I helped her believe it when the commissions were thin and the managers ignored her ideas. I built spreadsheets for her after midnight. I practiced sales pitches with her in the living room. I fixed that same old car in freezing driveways so she could get to work on time. It is strange how a memory can feel warm and insulting at the same time. Because standing in that showroom, watching her perform success for people who had never seen the years behind it, I realized she had not risen above our old life. She had started pretending she had never needed it. Frank Bellamy found me near the coffee bar around 9 o'clock. He was a broad-shouldered man with silver hair, a golf tan, and the careful smile of someone carrying private bad news. "Michael," he said, clapping one hand lightly on my shoulder. "Good of you to come out." His voice was friendly, but his eyes kept drifting toward the finance office. I had consulted for companies long enough to recognize Panic dressed in a blazer. "Big night," I said. "Jessica seems proud." Frank gave a small laugh that landed flat. "She is good at making things look good." There it was, thin as a crack in glass. I glanced toward the reception desk again, where a woman was quietly sliding envelopes into a drawer before guests noticed them. "Looks like a strong turnout," I said. Frank looked at the crowd, then at the cars, then at nothing in particular. "Turnout does not always equal profit." He caught himself and shook his head. "Listen to me. I am talking shop at a party." He walked away before I could answer, but the sentence stayed behind like cigar smoke. Turnout does not always equal profit. A few minutes later, Jessica appeared at my side, her perfume sharp and floral, her smile still on display. "Please do not hover around Frank looking serious," she whispered. "He is under pressure, and you make people feel like they are being audited." I looked at her. "Is the dealership in trouble?" Her eyes flashed, not with fear, but irritation. "This is exactly what I mean. You cannot just enjoy a nice evening. You have to turn everything into numbers. Numbers usually tell the truth." "No," she said, still smiling for the room while her voice cooled under it. "Numbers are what men hide behind when they do not have presence." That one was quieter than the parking lot joke, but it went deeper because it was not meant for laughs. It was meant for me. I took a sip of water. It tasted like metal. "I see," I said. She sighed, as if I were another chore waiting at home. "Just stay pleasant for another hour. Then you can take your little car and go home." She touched my arm again, that same staged affection, and drifted back toward Tyler and Amanda. I stood there under the bright showroom lights and felt the last soft excuse I had made for her fold in half. Not disappear, just fold, neatly, like a receipt you know you will need later. At 10:15, I stepped outside for air. The Ohio night was cool, the kind that smells faintly of asphalt and cut grass. My Taurus sat alone near the edge of the lot beneath a flickering lamp, dull blue paint catching almost no light at all. Beyond it, the dealership sign hummed over the rows of spotless vehicles. For the first time, I did not see a place that had embarrassed me. I saw inventory, land, debt, weak margins, a business with an aging owner, a proud manager, and a shine that might be covering rot. My phone buzzed before I reached the car. An unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Frank Bellamy's voice came through low and tired. "Michael, sorry to bother you. Do you still do private turnaround consulting?" I looked through the glass at Jessica laughing beside a red convertible, her hand lifted like she was blessing the room. The old Ford ticked softly beside me, faithful and ugly in mine. "Sometimes," I said. Frank exhaled like a man setting down a heavy box. "Then I need to talk. Not here. Not with Jessica around." I watched my wife raise her glass again, smiling at a world she thought belonged to her. My own smile came slowly this time, not happy, not cruel, just awake. "Tomorrow morning," I said. "Bring the real numbers." The next morning, the sun rose over Columbus with a soft, golden haze that reflected off the dealership sign, making it look almost serene, and for a moment I allowed myself to breathe without thinking about what had happened the night before. I walked to my old Taurus, unlocked the doors, and slid in, feeling the worn seat cushions mold to my shape like an old friend. The engine turned over smoothly, a gentle reminder that reliability was not about glamour, it was about consistency. I drove past neighborhoods I knew like the back of my hand, streets lined with maples that had lost their leaves in the crisp November air, thinking through numbers, not in panic but in calculation. Every red light became a pause, a chance to inventory what I had, my savings, my contacts, the quiet knowledge that Jessica had underestimated me for years. I reached a small coffee shop on the corner of 5th and Main where I had once met with small business owners to help them straighten ledgers and renegotiate leases. I ordered a large black coffee, the aroma sharp and clear, and sat down at a corner table with a view of the dealership across the street. The room smelled of roasted beans and parchment as I pulled my notebook from the glove compartment, a simple lined pad that had survived more than a decade of meetings and ideas. I wrote the numbers down, silently, methodically, without anyone noticing. Revenue streams, existing loans, payroll obligations, the market value of the showroom floor, the aging fleet of demo vehicles, the interest rates on floor plans. Everything that had been invisible to Jessica because she had been busy performing for guests was visible now to me in neat columns. As I sipped the coffee, I noticed the staff arriving, chatting, preparing for the morning rush. Jessica came in 15 minutes later, still in her heels, the white blazer pressed perfectly, her hair catching light with every movement. She waved at Tyler and Amanda, who immediately straightened and fell into their roles, ready to reflect the aura of competence she demanded. I watched her, not with envy, not with disdain, but with quiet attention. Every smile she gave, every hand she shook, every polite word she offered, I cataloged in my mind, noting moments when pride masked exhaustion or insecurity. This was not judgment, it was preparation. By 9:45, I had drawn up a preliminary strategy. Small investments first, options for silent acquisition, contacts at the local bank who trusted my judgment from years of consultancy. Nothing reckless, nothing impulsive, just deliberate movement, a chessboard taking shape in a world that thought I was only a pawn. Jessica glanced at the clock, checking appointments, making calls, her attention split between immediate crises and long-term appearances. I observed her multitasking, understanding that her competence had a ceiling she refused to admit. I left the coffee shop before 10, driving past the dealership once more, letting the cold air fill my lungs, and imagined scenarios where the tables could turn, where diligence and insight could outweigh performance and polish. Every lane I crossed, every familiar street corner, reinforced a sense of patience. The city moved around me, indifferent, and yet I felt it bend slightly to my awareness. I parked near a branch office of the local bank, stepped inside, and began a conversation with someone who had known my work ethic for years, speaking quietly, carefully, as if the words themselves were seeds planted in fertile ground. By 11:30, I had made calls, set meetings, and outlined a path that required no confrontation, no public spectacle, only foresight and precision. Outside, the dealership thrummed with activity, Jessica still performing excellence, unaware that the foundation she thought unshakable had quietly started to shift beneath her polished shoes. I walked back to the Taurus, feeling the weight of possibilities settle over my shoulders like a comfortable coat. The world was the same, yet my perception had changed. What she considered immovable, permanent, and secure could be rearranged by someone she never thought capable of it. And as I drove home slowly, passing the quiet neighborhoods, the old streetlights flickering in their predictable rhythm, I felt the calm certainty that would carry me through the months ahead, a quiet confidence that patience, knowledge, and careful planning were my allies, and that the first move in this silent game had already been made. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic on the highway and the occasional bark of a dog chasing a falling leaf. Michael parked the old Taurus behind his modest office building, the paint chipped and faded, but holding memories of long commutes, late nights, and the small victories that never made the headlines. He stepped out and adjusted the collar of his navy jacket, letting the crisp November air wake him fully, each breath sharp and clear like a bell tolling for opportunity. The office lobby smelled of paper, ink, and polished wood, familiar scents that grounded him in reality, reminding him that preparation and attention to detail were more valuable than appearances. Michael walked past the reception desk, nodded at a familiar face, and found an empty conference room bathed in natural light spilling through tall windows. He set the notebook from the morning coffee shop on the table, opened it to a fresh page, and began sketching timelines, potential acquisition steps, and the flow of capital he could mobilize without anyone noticing. Every line, every calculation, was deliberate, each one carrying the quiet authority of a man who had been underestimated for far too long. Outside, Jessica continued to charm clients and staff alike, her presence commanding attention, her laughter bright and effortless. She moved through the dealership like a conductor guiding an orchestra, unaware that the melody she controlled could soon change in key and tempo. Michael considered the staff, noticing how each employee mirrored her confidence or, in some cases, her anxieties, creating a network of loyalty and dependence that had once seemed insurmountable. He thought of Frank Bellamy, the owner, whose golf game and well-practiced smile masked the cracks in the business that Michael now could see with unclouded vision. He made mental notes of the vendor contracts, lease obligations, and the aging fleet of demo vehicles, cataloging each weakness with clinical precision. Michael sipped his coffee, black, strong, and bitter, savoring the clarity it brought to his thoughts. His eyes drifted to the showroom floor, the polished hoods reflecting the morning light, each vehicle a symbol of wealth and status that had been placed above the value of competence, hard work, and insight. He smiled slightly, not with joy, not with malice, but with recognition. Everything was visible to him now, and he was patient enough to let the pieces fall into place. He opened his laptop, checking bank statements, contacting long-trusted financial advisors, and sending discreet emails with the kind of precision that would later make the difference between success and failure. The clock ticked toward noon, and he could hear the faint chatter from the floor, phones ringing, clients asking questions he had already anticipated. Michael did not move to the showroom. He remained in the quiet light of the conference room, reviewing spreadsheets, projecting timelines, and imagining the moment when decisions made silently would ripple through the dealership. Each minute was a thread in the web he was weaving, each calculation a step in the dance he intended to lead. By 1 o'clock, he had outlined a tentative path forward, one that required no confrontation, no dramatics, only careful execution, stealth, and timing. He leaned back in his chair, letting the afternoon sun warm his face, and for the first time in years, Michael felt the calm authority that comes from knowing that preparation and knowledge were more powerful than status, appearances, or even charm. He thought of Jessica, still moving among staff and clients, unaware, confident, and brilliant in her element, and he felt no anger, only anticipation. The real work had begun. The stage was set, the pieces in motion, and Michael was no longer the man who had arrived the night before in a car too small, too old, and too familiar. He was a man quietly in command of what mattered, and the coming months would prove that presence, preparation, and insight mattered more than any performance or spectacle. By mid-afternoon, Michael had returned home to the modest suburban house he had shared with Jessica for nearly 2 decades. The air smelled faintly of fallen leaves and wood smoke from the neighbor's fireplace, comforting and ordinary, yet holding a subtle reminder of time passing and seasons changing. He placed his notebook on the kitchen table, where sunlight spilled across worn wood and scattered papers, and sat down with a fresh cup of coffee. The house was quiet except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic, the kind of silence that invites reflection. He opened his laptop and reviewed the emails and documents he had compiled throughout the morning, mapping out the precise steps to engage with financial advisors, draft offers, and quietly secure the necessary approvals for his plan. Every number, every account, every legal nuance was considered carefully, and he imagined how small adjustments could create a domino effect that no one, not even Jessica, would see coming. The rhythm of his day was methodical, almost meditative. He made phone calls to trusted contacts, confirming schedules for discrete meetings, and sent secure messages outlining terms that were plausible yet advantageous, ensuring that each move was calculated and stealthy. Outside, Jessica returned from the dealership, her car glinting in the afternoon sun, her presence commanding and elegant, yet unaware that the ground she walked on was subtly shifting beneath her. She carried herself with practiced ease, greeting neighbors and running errands with a polite smile, seemingly untouched by the tension Michael had allowed himself to cultivate in private. Michael watched her from the window, noting the patterns of her day, the habitual gestures, the reliance on the routines he knew well, and understood that her confidence was as much habit as it was strategy. He continued drafting plans, detailing contingencies, exit strategies, and the timeline that would allow him to act decisively without confrontation. By early evening, he had gathered all the pieces needed to begin the quiet phase of his strategy, understanding that patience and precision were his allies, and that any misstep could undo weeks of careful planning. The sky outside had turned a muted shade of gold, casting long shadows across the lawn, and he felt a steady calm as he considered the steps ahead. He revisited old records, reviewing contracts, sales data, and notes from previous meetings, each document providing insight into vulnerabilities he could exploit without raising suspicion. He imagined the reactions of staff, clients, and even Jessica herself when the outcomes of these calculated actions began to unfold. By 7 o'clock, Michael stepped outside for a brief walk, the air cool and crisp, letting the rhythm of his steps ground him as he reflected on how far he had come since the embarrassment in the parking lot. Every detail of the plan had been accounted for: the timing of communications, the order of acquisitions, and the sequence of approvals. He knew that slow, deliberate progress would yield results far beyond what any quick reaction could achieve. Returning inside, he reviewed the plan one last time, feeling a quiet satisfaction in knowing that each move had been considered, tested against potential risks, and designed to maintain discretion. The day closed with a sense of control and anticipation, the kind that comes from knowing that the first phase of a strategy is complete and the second phase, where consequences manifest and reputations are challenged, was imminent. He poured another cup of coffee, sat at the table bathed in the warm light of the setting sun, and allowed himself the smallest smile, a gesture of private acknowledgement that he was no longer the man defined by someone else's laughter, but the one quietly in command of the future unfolding before him. The next morning arrived gray and windless, with a low Ohio sky pressing against the windows like wet wool, and Michael woke before the alarm as if some part of him had been standing guard all night. Jessica was already gone, her side of the bed smooth and cold, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway like a signature left on a document. On the kitchen counter, she had left a note beside the coffee maker, not affectionate, not apologetic, just practical. Dinner with Amanda after work. Do not wait up. Michael read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in the drawer where old warranties and takeout menus went to be forgotten. There had been a time when a note like that would have made him ask questions. What time would she be home? Who else would be there? Did she want him to join? But asking questions had become another way of volunteering to be dismissed, and he had grown tired of offering her that chance. He poured coffee into a travel mug, black and bitter, then drove the Taurus through the pale morning traffic toward a brick office building near downtown Columbus, where Frank Bellamy had asked to meet away from the dealership. The old car hummed along Interstate 670 with the steady stubbornness of a machine that had nothing left to prove. At 9 o'clock sharp, Michael stepped into a small conference room on the third floor, where Frank sat at the end of a table with a banker's box beside him and the face of a man who had finally run out of theater. The golf tin looked dull under fluorescent lights. His silver hair was combed, but not confidently. He did not offer a joke. He did not mention Jessica. He simply pushed the box forward and said, "These are the real numbers." Michael sat across from him, opened the first folder, and let the silence do what silence does best. It made the truth uncomfortable enough to speak. The dealership was not failing loudly. It was worse than that. It was bleeding quietly behind polished glass and upbeat sales meetings. Floor plan interest had climbed month after month. Several luxury models had sat unsold for more than 120 days. 2 vendor accounts were past due. The service department, once the dependable backbone of the business, had lost 3 senior technicians in 6 months. Advertising costs had doubled, but lead quality had dropped. Jessica's events looked beautiful, her commercials looked confident, and her sales team looked energized when the cameras were near, but beneath all that shine, cash flow had become a narrow bridge over deep water. Michael read through the reports without changing expression. He had learned a long time ago that numbers do not need emotion added to them. They already know how to accuse. Frank watched him turn each page, his fingers rubbing the edge of his coffee cup. "She does not know how bad it is," Frank said at last. Michael looked up. "Jessica." Frank nodded. "She knows pieces. She explains them away. Market pressure, inventory cycles, interest rates, bad luck. There is always a reason, but the reasons do not pay the bills." Michael closed one folder and opened another. "Why call me?" Frank let out a dry laugh that carried no humor. "Because you understand ugly math, and because you are one of the few people in this town who can tell me the truth without trying to buy a favor from me." He paused, then added, "And because I am tired." That word changed the room. Tired was not a business metric, but it explained more than any spreadsheet. Tired owners make decisions proud owners avoid. Tired men stop polishing the windows and start looking for exits. Michael leaned back, feeling the shape of the opportunity sharpen. He did not pounce. He did not smile. He asked questions instead. Debt service, lease terms, inventory financing, franchise obligations, payroll exposure, reputation risk. Frank answered, sometimes quickly, sometimes after rubbing his forehead and staring at the table as if the truth had been written there in pencil. By the time noon light fell across the conference room carpet, Michael had a clear picture. Sterling Coast Motors could survive, but not under vanity. It needed discipline, capital, operational repair, and a leader willing to value the engine more than the paint. You asked for turnaround consulting, Michael said, placing the final report on the table. I can give you that, but advice alone will not fix this. Frank's eyes narrowed slightly, not offended, just wary. What would? Michael tapped the folder once. A restructuring. Fresh capital. A quiet ownership transition before the bank forces allowed one. The words landed cleanly. Frank looked away toward the narrow window overlooking downtown traffic. Far below, cars moved through intersections like pieces on a board. You are saying I should sell. I am saying you already know you have to. Frank turned back slowly. To whom? Michael held his gaze. In that moment, he thought of the parking lot lights, Jessica's laughter, Tyler's grin, Amanda's smirk, the old Taurus ticking alone at the edge of the lot. He thought of every late night he had helped Jessica prepare for a future she now treated like she had built alone. His voice stayed calm. Possibly to me. Frank studied him for a long time. Not because the idea was absurd, but because it was not. That was the first real shift. The world did not tilt. No thunder rolled. No glass shattered. Just an older man sitting across from him, realizing the husband everyone dismissed might be the only person in the room who understood the business well enough to save it. Jessica would never agree, Frank said. Michael reached for his coffee and took a slow sip. It had gone cold, but he did not mind. Jessica does not own it. Frank looked down at the papers, then back at Michael, and something like reluctant respect moved across his face. By early afternoon, they had not signed anything. They had not shaken hands on a final deal. But they had crossed a line neither of them could uncross. Frank agreed to let Michael review the books under a confidential advisory arrangement. Michael agreed to prepare a private proposal within 2 weeks. No staff involvement. No announcement. No Jessica. When Michael stepped back into the parking garage, the air felt colder than before, but cleaner too. He unlocked the Taurus, sat behind the wheel, and rested both hands there for a moment. Across town, Jessica was probably standing beneath showroom lights, telling someone that image was everything. Michael started the engine and listened to it catch on the first try. Some things did not need to look expensive to be dependable. Some things only needed time to prove who had been careless with value. By late afternoon, Michael returned to his home office, the space small and cluttered but comfortable, with sunlight filtering through blinds and casting lines across old framed diplomas and photographs of family vacations. He placed his laptop on the desk and opened the secure files Frank had allowed him access to, scrolling through spreadsheets, emails, and operational reports with careful attention. Each line was a story, a vulnerability, a potential leverage point, and Michael cataloged them silently in his mind like a chess player setting up pieces several moves in advance. Outside, the neighborhood moved along its quiet rhythm, the hum of children walking home from school, distant lawn mowers, the occasional car passing by. Jessica returned home shortly after 4, carrying a bag of groceries, her demeanor casual, her posture perfect, as if nothing had changed since the morning. She unpacked the bags, set the items in the kitchen, and glanced over her shoulder at Michael with a faint, polite smile. Busy day? She asked, her tone light. Michael nodded, eyes on the spreadsheets. It was productive, he said evenly, not raising his voice, letting calm dominate every word. He imagined her asking what productive meant, but she did not, already moving toward the living room to make a phone call. He watched her, noting the familiar gestures, the way she tilted her head when concentrating on a conversation, the way her fingers tapped lightly on the phone screen. All habitual, all predictable, all pieces in the puzzle he was quietly constructing. Michael sipped his coffee and opened another folder, reviewing inventory lists, vendor obligations, and the dealership's past sales reports. He noted patterns, months where certain vehicles remained unsold, periods when cash flow had been tight, times when Jessica had covered shortages with optimism rather than operational skill. Each observation reinforced the approach he was taking: methodical, quiet, precise. No dramatic gestures, no confrontation, only strategy. The sun shifted lower, casting long shadows across the office floor, and Michael realized hours had passed unnoticed. He leaned back in his chair and let his thoughts wander over the layout of the dealership, the people, the financial threads weaving through the business. By the time 5 o'clock came, he had drafted a preliminary plan for acquisition steps, a schedule of discreet communications with stakeholders, and a sequence of offers designed to remain invisible until they were complete. Each move was calculated to maintain discretion, avoid suspicion, and maximize leverage. He imagined presenting the plan to Frank in a week, how the older man would nod, impressed by foresight and thoroughness, unaware that Michael's strategy had already begun to alter the future of the dealership. As he reviewed the final notes for the day, he heard the faint hum of Jessica in the kitchen, making dinner and chatting on the phone. Her confidence was effortless, but it had a blind spot, one that Michael had identified early and would exploit with care. The plan was in motion. Every document, every number, every observation was a step toward a future no one yet realized. Michael set his pen down, sipped the cooling coffee, and looked out the window at the parking lot where his old Taurus rested. Beyond it, the dealership sign glowed faintly in the evening light, a symbol of everything polished and performative. Michael did not rush. He did not fume. He simply noted the alignment of circumstances, the vulnerability hidden in brilliance, and allowed the quiet satisfaction of preparation to settle over him. The evening deepened, lights turning on across the neighborhood, and Michael began to imagine the moment months from now when every careful move would converge, turning assumptions on their head, rewarding patience, and proving that insight and strategy outweighed spectacle and charm. He closed the laptop, organized the folders neatly, and for the first time that day, allowed himself a slow, controlled smile. The work had begun, and the pieces were moving exactly as he had foreseen. 2 weeks passed with the strange quiet of a storm gathering behind closed curtains. To Jessica, life continued in the shape she preferred. She left early, came home late, dressed sharply, spoke in confident fragments, and treated the dealership like a stage where every day required a flawless performance. To Michael, those same 2 weeks became a corridor of numbers, signatures, private calls, and carefully timed meetings in rooms where nobody laughed at his car, because nobody in those rooms was foolish enough to mistake appearance for leverage. He met Frank Bellamy twice more at the downtown office, once at a small accounting firm near German Village, and once in the back corner of a quiet steakhouse where the lights were low, the booths were deep, and the waiters knew when not to interrupt. Each time, Frank brought more paper. Each time, Michael brought fewer assumptions. The truth grew clearer with every folder. Sterling Coast Motors had survived for years on momentum, reputation, and the old goodwill Frank had built when people still bought cars with handshakes and local trust. But the modern business had changed. Interest rates had tightened the floor plan. Luxury buyers were shopping harder. Service customers were drifting to independent shops. Jessica's glossy events brought attention, but attention was not the same as cash. She could fill a showroom with music, balloons, and catered food, but she could not make an unsold $80,000 SUV stop costing money every day it sat under the lights. Michael did not say that with satisfaction. He said it the way a doctor reads bad lab work, steady, factual, without pretending the numbers had feelings. Frank listened. That was the difference. Jessica had spent years making people applaud. Frank had reached the age where he needed someone to tell him whether the roof was on fire. By the end of the second week, Michael had assembled the proposal. Not reckless, not emotional. A structured buyout with staged capital, debt, restructuring, a service department rebuild, tighter inventory discipline, and a quiet transition period that would keep the staff calm and the bank cooperative. He used a limited liability company to keep his name out of casual conversation until the documents required otherwise. There was nothing illegal about it, nothing sneaky in the way small people use that word, just privacy and timing. In business, Timing is often the line between being underestimated and being unstoppable. On a Friday morning, with frost still clinging to the grass and the Taurus warming in the driveway, Michael drove to the bank wearing the same navy suit Jessica had once approved for public appearances. The irony did not escape him. He sat across from a commercial lending officer named Peter Lawson, a careful man with rimless glasses and a habit of tapping a pen against his legal pad. Peter had known Michael for 9 years through consulting work, and that history mattered. Reputation is a kind of credit score no computer fully measures. Michael walked him through the plan slowly, every figure supported, every risk acknowledged before Peter could raise it. He did not oversell. He did not beg. He simply showed how a business bleeding quietly could become stable again under disciplined ownership. Peter tapped his pen less as the meeting went on. By the final page, he had stopped tapping entirely. "You understand this place better than some people who have worked there for years," he said. Michael thought of Jessica under showroom lights, smiling as if confidence could replace cash flow. "I have had time to study it," he replied. By noon, the bank had not given final approval, but the door was open wide enough to walk through. By 3, Frank called with a voice that sounded older than it had 2 weeks before. "I read your offer again," he said. "My attorney did too." Michael stood in his office, looking out at the quiet street where a delivery truck rolled past slowly. "And," Frank exhaled, "it is fair, maybe more fair than I deserve." That sentence carried weight. Men like Frank did not admit that easily. Michael waited. He had learned not to fill silence when silence was doing the work. "There is one condition," Frank said. "I do not want Jessica blindsided by rumors. She has worked hard, even if she has been looking at the wrong scoreboard. When this becomes real, it needs to be handled cleanly." Michael looked down at his wedding ring, still on his hand, still catching light like a small, stubborn question. "Cleanly," he said, not softly. Frank was quiet for a beat. "Fair enough." The letter of intent was signed the following Tuesday in a conference room that smelled of toner and burnt coffee. Frank's attorney sat on one side, Michael's attorney on the other, the documents stacked in careful order between them like bricks for a new foundation. Michael signed with the same pen he had used for mortgage papers, tax filings, consulting contracts, and one long-ago birthday card where he had promised Jessica they would build something lasting. The memory passed through him, but it did not stop his hand. When Frank signed after him, the room did not erupt. No music played. No one clapped. The biggest turns in a man's life are often quiet enough to miss if you are looking for fireworks. The ownership transfer would take time, pending bank approval, franchise review, and legal closing, but control had begun moving. Quietly. Officially. Irreversibly. That evening, Michael came home to find Jessica at the kitchen island with her laptop open, a glass of iced tea beside her, and irritation written across her face. "Frank has been acting strange," she said without looking up. Michael set his keys in the bowl by the door. The Taurus key landed with a dull plastic click. "Strange how? Secretive. Distracted. And now finance is asking for updated reports like we are preparing for an audit." She looked at him then, eyes sharp. "Do you know anything about that?" There it was, the first tremor under the polished floor. Michael could have lied easily. He could have played confused. But deception had never been his strength, and he did not need it. "I know businesses review numbers when pressure builds," he said. Jessica frowned. "That sounds like one of your consultant answers." "It is." She gave a short laugh, not amused. "Well, whatever is going on. Frank needs to remember who actually runs that place day to day." Michael walked to the sink and rinsed his coffee mug, keeping his back to her long enough for the smallest smile to disappear. "I am sure he knows exactly who has been running it," he said. She missed the weight in the sentence. Pride often does that. It hears agreement when warning is standing right in front of it. Later that night, while Jessica took a call in the living room, Michael sat in his office and opened the scanned copy of the signed letter. His name was not on the dealership sign yet. His authority was not public. Jessica still believed she stood at the center of the room. But somewhere beneath the visible world, the locks had started changing. He looked out the window at the old Taurus resting under the porch light, its faded hood silvered by the moon, and felt that steady calm again. She had laughed because she thought the car proved he had no ambition. She never considered the possibility that a man who refuses to waste money on image might know exactly how to buy what image cannot save. The final approval arrived on a Thursday morning. hidden inside an ordinary email with a subject line so plain that most people would have scrolled past it without a second thought. Michael was sitting in his home office with the same black coffee, the same wooden desk, and the same old Taurus visible through the window. Nothing around him looked different. That was the strange thing about moments that change everything. They rarely announce themselves. The bank had completed its review. The franchise requirements had been cleared. The attorneys had finalized the remaining documents. Sterling Coast Motors was entering a new chapter, and almost nobody inside the building knew who would be holding the pen. Michael read the message twice, not because he doubted it, but because he understood the weight of it. 18 years earlier, he had sat beside Jessica on the floor of a tiny apartment, helping her rehearse conversations with customers because she was afraid she would never make it in sales. Now he was preparing to walk into the same business where she had forgotten every quiet sacrifice that helped build her confidence. He closed the laptop and sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle. He expected satisfaction to feel louder. He expected some rush of victory. Instead, it felt like clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop asking someone else to recognize your value. By noon, Frank called. His voice carried relief and sadness at the same time. "It is done," he said. 2 simple words. Months of stress, years of mistakes, decades of work, compressed into one sentence. Michael looked at the framed photo on his bookshelf from a vacation years ago, back when he and Jessica still looked like 2 people moving in the same direction. "How are you feeling?" Michael asked. Frank laughed softly, like a man who finally admitted he was carrying something too heavy. There was no celebration, no arrogance, just transition. Frank agreed to announce the ownership change at the dealership meeting the following Monday. Until then, everything remained quiet. That weekend moved slowly. Jessica noticed. She was too sharp not to. On Saturday morning, she watched Michael reading financial reports at the kitchen table and narrowed her eyes. "You have been different lately," she said. Michael looked up. "Different how?" She searched for the right words. "Calmer. Like you know something everyone else does not." He almost smiled at the accuracy of it. "Maybe I just stopped worrying about things I cannot control." Jessica leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I hope you are not still upset about that dealership event." There it was. Weeks later, the moment that had shifted everything was just a small inconvenience in her memory. Something she assumed he needed to get over. Michael studied her expression and realized something important. She truly did not understand. To her, it had been a joke about a car. To him, it had been a window into what she believed about him. "Why would you think I was upset?" he asked. She shrugged. "You got quiet afterward." Michael nodded slowly. "Sometimes quiet means someone is listening." She frowned, but her phone rang before she could answer, and just like always, the conversation disappeared behind something she considered more important. Monday arrived cold and clear. Michael put on his Navy suit, picked up his keys, and drove the Taurus towards Sterling Coast Motors. He intentionally parked in the same spot near the edge of the lot. The old car looked exactly as it had before. Same faded paint, same dent, same history. But this time, he stepped out knowing something nobody else did. Inside, the staff gathered around the showroom. Jessica stood near the front beside Tyler and Amanda, looking impatient. "Does anyone know what this is about?" she asked. People shook their heads. A few minutes later, Frank entered with Michael beside him. The conversations faded. Jessica looked confused first, then irritated. "Michael, what are you doing here?" The room went quiet enough to hear the automatic doors open behind a customer outside. Michael did not answer immediately. Frank stepped forward. "Everyone, I have an announcement. After many years running Sterling Coast Motors, I have decided to retire and transfer ownership to someone I trust to protect what we built." Jessica smiled slightly, already preparing to clap politely for some investor she imagined walking through the door. Then Frank turned. "Michael Anderson is the new owner." Silence. Complete silence. The kind of silence that makes people replay every word they have ever said. Jessica's smile disappeared slowly. Tyler looked down. Amanda blinked like she was waiting for someone to correct the sentence. Michael stood there calmly, the same man they had laughed at, wearing the same suit, carrying the same keys. Nothing about him had changed except what they knew. That was the lesson. Value does not appear when people discover it. It was already there. They were just too distracted to notice. Jessica finally spoke, her voice quieter than he had heard in years. "You bought it." Michael nodded. I invested in something I believed could be better. She looked toward the parking lot, where the Taurus sat beneath the morning light. The irony finally reached her. Why did you never tell me you could do something like this? Michael thought about all the nights she had stopped asking questions, all the times she chose appearances over understanding. Because you stopped believing I could before you ever asked. The words were not angry. That made them heavier. Over the following weeks, the dealership changed. Not overnight. Real improvement never works that way. Michael rebuilt the service department, repaired vendor relationships, adjusted inventory, and listened to employees who had spent years feeling ignored. Jessica remained during the transition, but things between them were different. The balance had shifted, not because Michael wanted power over her, but because he finally remembered he had power over himself. Months later, the Taurus was still parked outside. Employees joked about it sometimes, but with respect now. They understood. That car was not a symbol of failure. It was proof that some people build quietly, move carefully, and never need the world to clap before they know what they are worth.